I'm not a huge horror aficionado. I don't really do slasher movies. My favorite horror movie is Jaws. But it feels a bit different in video games because it puts you in the situation and makes it feel more tense and personal, but even a decent amount of horror games never really grabbed my attention. Dead Space, Fear, a couple of Resident Evils. It's just not a genre I normally go too far out of my way for, outside of a really bizarre, unexplained horror kick I had about a year ago. I have no idea why, but I watched about 10 horror movies back to back, best of which were Sweetheart and His House, both available on Netflix. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a genre that I actively avoided, it's closer to being a genre that I passively discarded. All the way back when, in 2008, I stood in a GameStop perusing the shelf for Nintendo Wii titles. Hear me out. My eyes fell on an action game that I had beaten some years back, before 2008. I wanted more of it in my life. Yes, indeed. My favorite action game with bad writing, Resident Evil 4. Pioneering the genre, this game has stood the test of time and stands among my favorite games to watch speedrunners annihilate. I've beaten it several times, and I'm sure I will beat it several more. Years pass, but Resident Evil 4 has endured. And still to this day, I truly love this game. I skipped the cutscenes, but I love the game. Eventually, a couple of years later, I played the Dead Space trilogy, which is essentially 2 horror games and 1 action game. I love 1 and 2, but there's something about the third, it's a little hard to put a finger on why it feels this way. But Dead Space 3 feels like the entire game is a prologue. Something about it just never really feels like it started. I still had fun with it though, and it was a fun time on co-op too. Good as the Dead Space games are, they don't quite call me back to the Futon like Resident Evil 4 does. There's a lot to love with the trilogy, and I truly hope the remaster of the original can get us that 4th installment that I think the franchise deserves. That and Fear. Fear 4, please. Oh, an eternal dark, but on my life went, dipping my foot into the horror video game pool here and there, but finding most of my satisfaction in the worlds of Zelda, Super Smash Bros., and Devil May Cry. But in 2014, a certain game caught my attention. Not with a trailer, not with any of the music, and not with any names attached to it. What caught my attention was the image that would adorn the cover of the game. A face, contorted in anger, protest, pain, or all three, wrapped in barbed wire and sharply detailed in monochrome, save for the eyes, which were tinted in a piercing red. It was a striking image, and I never forgot it. Who were they looking at? Were they being held back, propelled forward? Were they captive? The image was so open to interpretation that it had always intrigued me whenever it came to mind over the next 8 years. This was the cover of horror meister Shinji Mikami's The Evil Within. Shinji Mikami is no stranger to horror. He is the creative force behind Resident Evil 1 and 4. I had read good things about The Evil Within, but I am a mighty frugal fellow, and I did not pick it up. I had a couple of months of Game Pass that I got to use, and The Evil Within was at the top of my list to try. So, while the world came together collectively to learn what the word hearsay means,
A megapint.
I slapped this game on, and I braced for the terror. Something similar to Resident Evil 4 is kind of what I went into this game expecting. And after my first day playing this game, I felt weird. The game opens with a gruesome crime scene, followed by your protagonist naturally going unconscious and waking up in the captivity of a horrifying human chop shop run by a chainsaw-wielding maniac. Classic horror game stuff. Still pretty gross, though. But something I did not know about this game when I started playing it is that it is not an easy game. See, gonna cut my head off.
Holy God, what are you showing me? His head. Come on!
On my first playthrough, I died somewhere in the neighborhood of 273 times. Now, that fact alone should tell you a couple of things. 1, this game is either really hard, or I'm an atrocious gamer. 2, I was compelled to see it through no matter what. A couple of chapters into this game, of which there are 15, the game started to come off to me as something I haven't really seen a console horror game do before. It's hard to put into words, and I'm gonna try to phrase it as carefully as I can, but I had the mistaken impression that this game was made to be almost in the style of an arcade game, ludicrously difficult and separated by one difficult area after another. The kind of game that would shred through your quarters if ever it were to be put to cabinet. And while that is true, I almost feel like that belittles how much thought was actually put into the game. It's not just designed to relentlessly pound you into the ground, it's designed to push you and make sure that you make every shot count. Do it. Okay. It's designed to force you to learn by repetition. And for me, it did something right, because the footage you're seeing right now is not my first playthrough. It's my third. When I finished this game, the plan was to just hop right into the second one and pick up where I left off. But I was compelled to go through this campaign again, and that's what I did. Immediately. For what it's worth, I do think the story in this game is better than Resident Evil 4, and while the regenerators are forever terrifying, I do think this game is overall scarier. It's certainly gorier. I do think a lot of the dialogue is pretty stilted.
Sorry, detectives. I know you're just coming off a case, but I'm afraid we're gonna have to make a detour.
Sounds serious. Is it a riot?
And when it comes to the actors, it can be hard to pin down where exactly the issues are coming from. Is it coming from the actors, or is it coming from the directing? And when you don't know what it's really like behind the scenes, it can be super hard to tell. But some of the actors are able to work with the material well enough to make this game a fine entry on their IMDb profile. And besides all that, even now, almost 8 years later, this game looks really good. The visuals are grainy, and the environments are all distinct and had a lot of care put into them. A city crumbles apart as monsters roam about. A mansion demands you solve its odd, sentient puzzles. Fragments of different plotlines are fed to you through spectral cutscenes. Journal entries of how Sebastian's marriage tragically fell apart are found near the hum of the Clair de Lune. Finally got my gold badge. Detective Sebastian Castellanos. I like the sound of that. Interestingly enough, this game is also presented in widescreen, putting black bars on the top and bottom. This was a pretty funky choice, but all in all, I actually came to like it. It didn't ultimately end up feeling trite or pointless, but I didn't feel like they were presenting me with a movie at the same time. It didn't feel pretentious. It's almost like the game was telling me to focus, removing space that would only serve as a distraction in what was sure to be a game taking place largely in close quarters. It felt like it had been a really long time since I played a game that was like this. It's smooth and clunky all at once, like a refined engine that chugs so loud you wonder if it's actually working okay. You play as Detective Sebastian Castellanos, a gritty trench-coat-clad detective who is on the case to figure out the story behind this white-robed killer, simply known as Ruvik. And before the game tells you much, it puts you in a fight for your life. Ordinary keys. Over the course of the game, you get the standard weapons you would think you do. You start with a pistol, you get a shotgun, you get a sniper rifle, you beat the game once, you get a machine gun, you get a rocket launcher, you get a crossbow. If it's something you would think you would have in a game like this, you probably have it in this game. All of the weapons are naturally upgradable. You'll notice at the start of the game that your sprint time is extremely short. I'm not quite sure how this man is on the force with low stamina like this. Your sprint time is definitely one of the first things you're going to want to upgrade. And you know, the upgrade system itself is quite clever. It actually makes sense given the premise of the game. It's shock therapy. Throughout the 15 chapters, you'll be scrounging for resources, attempting to disarm traps for extra parts to make some crossbow bolts, don't mess up, and fighting all sorts of baddies you would expect to see. Crazy chainsaw bad guy, long-haired grudge bad guy, the you can't see my face bad guy. The classics. And they do well here. Each boss fight feels unique and requires you to make the most of your environment in which they take place, with maybe one exception. When I saw one of the bosses, I found myself thinking, oh, there's no way they're gonna have me fight. You have to fight that thing. Several bosses are one-hit kills, in that if they catch up to you, you are done. Ah, God, dang it. Sometimes it might not feel fair, but it forces you to make adjustments in a way that I appreciate. When you finally get that last shot that takes a boss down, it's genuinely satisfying. Normally when I go through games like this, I try to get as far as I can without upgrading at all. Could not tell you why. There's something in my brain that makes me feel super disorganized whenever I upgrade my character to be super strong in one area, but I can't get them to that same degree in other areas. And I had to fight that natural instinct to keep everything at level 1, because doing that makes this game far more difficult than it already is. It just kind of makes me feel imbalanced, even a little disorganized. Don't be like me. I highly recommend upgrading several key stats as you go through this game, not the least of which is the crossbow, which adds burn damage when it is fully upgraded. Burn damage may not sound like much, but actually it's huge. Lighting an enemy on fire is an instant kill, even against many of the stronger variations. In this game, if you down an enemy but they're not done for, and you have a match inventory, you can strike it, drop it, and that will take care of the enemy. But also, if you fire a shot that takes down multiple enemies and drop a match on the pile, they're all done. And that gives this game a strategic element that I did not catch on to at first. Herding enemies close together can lead to a big payoff, so you can keep your precious ammunition for the next encounter. The Evil Within also pays attention to some kind of wacky details. Late in the game, there's a room where you cannot shoot your guns because highly flammable gas is flooding the room. So if you take on a stealthy approach to this room, but you still need to take enemies down, you're forced to use the crossbow. However, if it is fully upgraded, I mean, it felt like a sucker punch, but honestly, that was fair game. Anything you find yourself suspending your disbelief too far for in this game ultimately does make sense for the most part. Like, why does this random ghost lady come bursting out of the house on fire? Initially, it just feels kind of like a random one-off cheap scare, but it actually makes sense with the rest of the story once you know everything. It's not exactly a plot that I'm going to stop the presses for, but I think it's innovative enough in the genre to be at least above average. The script itself is kind of rough, but the premise they're working with I think is pretty solid. The Evil Within is rather aware of the fact that some enemies take a serious amount of ammunition to take down, going so far as to make one of the bosses partially optional. But even when you're not getting taken down by hordes of enemies, sometimes the environment plays its own devious hand. Take this room for example. Even on my third playthrough, which resulted in approximately 70 deaths, not 17, 7-0, this room took way too many of them. A single spinning blade goes around the room in circles, and can be a one-hit kill on enemies, if it connects. So I get past the enemies and see a pickup on the ground. Well, any normal person would stay low while picking up the item, but not our clever detective here. I guess I'm doing this room again. I'm kind of ashamed to admit how many times this room took me out on my third playthrough, let alone my first. Anything that I thought would help me get through it more quickly just didn't pan out. Honestly, this room by itself is a pretty good allegory for how to take on this game. Be patient, learn from every mistake, place your shots carefully, and never underestimate what a single enemy can do to you. Chapters 1 through 9 do very well in bringing you to various memorable environments, pitting you against great bosses, and preparing you for the godforsaken gauntlet that is Chapter 10. Don't get me wrong, I love this chapter. It is not made with kindness in mind. It's long, has a lot of enemies that can soak up a ton of ammo, and has 2 separate boss battles in it. This chapter feels like the proving grounds for the game, requiring you to mix your stealth with well-placed shots, traps, and knowing when to blow your own cover to get through to the objective. This is actually one of my favorite parts of the game, but when I recorded this third playthrough, it took me until then to realize just how much was packed into this single chapter. My first playthrough of this game took me somewhere around 19 hours, and my third took me closer to 9. Clearly, the game gets easier the stronger you are, but even after 3 playthroughs, my character is still not quite fully upgraded. Upgrades are expensive, and the currency is a precious resource. After you get through the first playthrough of the game, the Evil Within is a lot more liberal with giving you more green gel that you can use to upgrade yourself. You have to decide pretty wisely on your first playthrough what exactly you're going to upgrade. But once you complete the game the first time, you are rewarded with so much of the currency that the game immediately feels easier on your second go round. Almost any game I play for the first time, I just play it on normal difficulty, especially if it's not some kind of a co-op game. Yes, all this difficulty I'm discussing is born from simply normal mode. There are 2 difficulty levels higher than this. Watching speedrunners go through the highest difficulty, Akuma, which is 1 level beyond hard, is quite a sight to behold. And if you are really eager to take on the challenge, completing the game on any difficulty will unlock Akuma difficulty. It's really rare for me to finish any video game and think to myself that I immediately want to play it again, especially if there's a sequel ready to go and installed on the hard drive for me to boot up. I can't think of the last time that's ever happened, but The Evil Within was the horror game of a bygone era that I knew I would enjoy diving right back into. So, drawbacks? Yeah, some. The first 2/3 of this game are fantastic. Commonly used settings in a lot of horror games feel pretty fresh here. Yes, the third act of the game stumbles a little bit for me, moving a good portion of the setting to a city in broad daylight. I've yet to come across any horror game that is very adept at making this particular kind of setting frightening. Maybe it's out there somewhere, but I felt a little deflated once I moved into the city like this. The game never wears out its welcome, it's still fun, it just loses a decent portion of that tension that it had for so long. That is, until Chapter 14. And this section of the game between Chapters 11 and 14 does feature the one boss that I was kinda disappointed with. But for real, I think this game is good enough to warrant a spot among the greats. The developers did an incredible job on the environments. The game makes a lot of very intentional choices in its presentation that I really appreciated, and the difficulty on normal mode for me, while frustrating at times, was just enough for me to genuinely feel satisfied whenever I would finally make progress after a hard-fought battle. I don't think this game is in the league of difficulty notoriously found in something like the Soulsborne series, at least not on normal difficulty. So I wouldn't go into it expecting something like that. The game also does have a couple of downloadable content expansions, but I haven't had an avenue by which to play them yet. So I can't really account for their quality, but I'd like to play them someday. Again, The Evil Within is 8 years old, so it's on the cheaper side now. Last I checked, it was $20 for a digital copy, and it's probably less for a physical copy. If you have the stomach for it and have enjoyed survival horror in the past, I think it stands pretty tall. I went into it hoping for a game I could enjoy like I enjoyed RE4, and at first I didn't think that's what I got, but in the end, for the most part, it is. The standards for horror in gaming have not changed that much over the last decade, and if anything, they have steered more towards being action games than horror games. I think The Evil Within walks the line really well, and if you have found yourself liking the greats of the genre before it or after it, I recommend this as a title that stands alongside them. Even though all this footage has been my third playthrough of The Evil Within, it was after beating The Evil Within for the second time that I dove into the sequel. The Evil Within 2. No subtitle. The footage that you'll see is actually my second playthrough of The Evil Within 2, and the game wastes no time in making sure that you are very aware that they are playing with some fancy new graphics. Where the art for the first game grabbed me with this brutal, grimy aesthetic, the art for The Evil Within 2 is quite the opposite. Instead of looking drenched in concrete, it's covered in a liquid sheen. Hands grasp Sebastian as he closes his eyes in some form of surrender or preparation. Quite a far cry from the man we saw in the art for the first game. Now, this game looks beautiful, even if I do think Sebastian's facial hair is a bit thicker than your average dude. For reasons I'm not sure of, the voice cast is shuffled around, and Shinji Mikami has stepped down as director, but has taken up a role as a supervisor. I don't even really want to give the early game synopsis on what The Evil Within 2 is about, because it does feature some kind of light spoilers that could be meaningful to a player going through it for the first time. So I'm going to stay kind of surface level with this one. The game has a really good opener, and a premise that makes sense given the material of the previous game. We're immediately set up with an intriguing villain and another long-haired lady monster. Credit given where it's due, though, she's pretty freaky. Soon enough, there it is. That feeling hits me. Like that first dip into a hot tub. A familiar warmth that reeks of safety and solace. That bit of familiarity in a foreign world just hit me so right. A couple of chapters into the game, when you discover the first safe house in the game's overworld, you are quickly hit with a splash of cold water. See, both games were developed at Mikami's own studio, Tango, and both games were also distributed by Bethesda. And here, you can really taste the Bethesda. You can even see the transition where this becomes a Bethesda game.
I'm O'Neill. Liam O'Neill.
So you're not Mobius, but they sent you in here? Why?
This was a weird creative choice that I was not much for. These Bethesda-esque conversations are awkward for The Evil Within.
You made it here okay.
Not sure if okay now.
Union was most of the, but their we call it.
It doesn't.
Fortunate, but it's a
Where's the...
all marked looks once you're that should.
You could have...
Maybe so.
A gamble in most horror games, as usually a big piece of the foundations of the horror lie in isolation. You'll also notice in this footage that the letterboxing is now gone. Also feels very strange to have it be a post-game unlockable. Clearly the game wasn't made with it in mind as its predecessor was, as the letterboxing can at times awkwardly cut off parts of the screen during cutscenes and the Bethesda conversations. The footage you see here, being my second playthrough, I actually left the bars on for a good portion of the game to see if I would like it or not, but The Evil Within 2 is not nearly as claustrophobic as its predecessor. As a matter of fact, it's open world. That being said, it genuinely helps to see as much of the screen as you can. There's a main campaign for you to follow and several side missions that you can accomplish. However, most of them seem to simply end in you picking up some ammo. In The Evil Within 2, you don't pick up raw ammo too often. The game has a crafting system for that, and this time, Sebastian's upgrades are separate from his weapon upgrades. Weapons are upgraded with parts. Sebastian is upgraded with another currency, the same as the Evil Within 1, green gel. And red gel. Whatever. Now, I know it's going to sound like I'm harping pretty harshly on this game, but just give me a minute here. Or maybe like 5 minutes, because I'm about to sound really mean to this game. The writing in this game is kind of bizarre. It does this thing that I honestly cannot stand when movies and shows do. Early on, it references the previous game almost to try to minimize its impact and make you think you're in for something bigger, better, more challenging.
It's just as bad as Beacon in here. No, it's worse.
Tagoro is just a B class?
I just don't think that's a good idea for any sequel to do, to right off the bat be like, oh man, this is tougher than what happened before. This is worse than what happened before. Like, what happened before was still pretty rough, dude. I don't think this game is as hard as the first one, but in a weird way, it feels less fair. The game completely does away with the matches that are used in the first game to take down the enemies that are grounded. It does give you a melee attack you can use if enemies are on the ground, which, fair point, the first one had too. But groups of enemies made that pointless. In this game, if you take down a group of enemies at the same time, you're not rewarded for it. You have to pick one and take them out and suffer the consequences of not taking them all out. It removes an element of strategy from the combat and made it feel less rewarding overall. More often, I was just running away to stay alive rather than having any particular strategy in mind. It was just such a rush to herd the enemies together in the first one and manipulate them to be where I wanted them to be so I could take them all down at once. In this game, more often than not, you'll just find yourself running and taking out enemies one at a time. And doing it very carefully because you might chew through your ammo more quickly than you realize. More often than not, if I ran into enemies that I didn't have to fight to make progress, I just ran. Within the first couple of chapters, the game sets up an antagonist for you to pursue. There's a murderer running amok, and the game sets you up to pursue within the opening act. And yes, light spoilers, but not really that big, since the murderer does not turn out to be anybody you know from any of the franchise's previous material. He's this funky photographer dude named Stefano Valentini. And with a name like that, you know he's a photographer. I say this as a photographer. Well, turns out he likes making dead people art, naturally. He's this super pretentious dude who just doesn't feel like a good fit. If anything, he just feels like the outlier, and it's a shame because the premise that created this character is interesting, but then he just becomes this weird, goofy villain that has one of the most unfair attacks I've come across in a boss fight. And again, light spoilers, as he is absolutely not the endgame boss. His goal is ultimately just to have his dead people art go uncriticized by utilizing a power that lets him customize the world around him. With his power, he could do anything, make anything, and all he wants to do is be appreciated for his dead people art. You could drop a feather on his ego and it would shatter. I don't really care about this dude. His ultimate enemy is, from his perspective, the ignorance of the people who write him off. One of the missions of the campaign is you following his instructions to literally appreciate the art. Ugh. I mean, credit to his actor. The guy does a good job bringing him to life.
Agreed. You're beginning to bore me. Your death will be art.
It just seems like a really goofy trope to spring for in a premise that is so ripe with possibility. And because I'm not doing spoilers here, please rest assured and just know he is not the only goofy antagonist in this affair. He's just the goofiest. Carrying on though, in Bethesda tradition, the game also features an eyeball that's at the top center of the screen to let you know if you are hidden, if you're being hunted, or if an enemy has spotted you. It's good in that it helps you be more aware of your surroundings, but it's bad in that it takes away from a bit of the tension in some of the encounters. Another feature built into the game is the option to actually play it in first-person perspective, and I did do it a little bit in certain environments just to get more appreciation for some of the design choices. But overall, this just doesn't feel like a great game to go through in first-person mode. And while I may not have been much for the first antagonist that the game threw at me, the opening chapters themselves are pretty good. The environments feel fresh and creepy, not because of the at times literally pulsating world that the original had, but because this game looks so much smoother. Several of the bosses have some pretty solid designs, with the final boss probably having my favorite of the bunch. And now, for my last bit of harping on this game. Where I said the original game has strength throughout, despite a slightly waning third act, The Evil Within 2 has the opposite problem. The first 2/3 are weaker than its final portion. The last few chapters of this game are really good. I'm not going to talk about them too much because I think they're worth being experienced, but a levity is given to the story that serves it really well and brings the game to a conclusion that I was overall satisfied with. I know it sounds like I'm being really mean to this game, and part of it just comes from the fact that I really like the first one. Sometimes it's hard to be nice to a sequel when the original carved out such a special place for itself, and I'm not being punny when I say that. I suppose I should make it clear that I don't think The Evil Within 2 is a bad game. Like, not really at all. It made some changes, and while yes, I did find most of those changes to be disappointing, the game looks great and the gameplay itself is actually really solid. And while it takes a little bit of time, the story does eventually pick up some steam. When I decided to make this video, I was still in the middle of playing the first game for the second time, but I figured it would only be appropriate to cover all my bases here and discuss the second one as well. I genuinely recommend both of these games. It's just that the first one kind of ended up feeling like something special. It's a game that challenges you to think your strategies through carefully, and pitting you against monsters that feel like the colossal challenge that they are, only for your dread to give way to joy when you finally find that right strategy. I'm hoping the day comes where this franchise gets a third installment, and I hope it has a lot of love put into not just the gameplay, but the story too. The recently released game Ghostwire Tokyo actually started development as The Evil Within 3, but just like how Devil May Cry spun off from Resident Evil 4's development, Ghostwire became its own entity, and the status of The Evil Within 3 has returned to myth. As I began writing this script, I saw that a content creator that I appreciate, The Sphere Hunter, released her own video essay on The Evil Within, and I'll put a link to it in the description. She's a good content creator and you should check out her stuff. And now that I have written and recorded, I feel better about watching it so I can make sure that I don't consciously or unconsciously commandeer any of her material. Like I said, she's a really good content creator and you should check out her stuff. I don't have a beautiful or poetic monologue planned out to end this video. All I can say is that if you enjoy well-crafted horror, I think these games are worth playing, especially the first one. Claustrophobic corridors pulsate with horrors, both seen and unseen, and despite some flat characterization, the design and gameplay choices made here are enough to call me back. The story here isn't revolutionary, but the foundations are solid, and the craftsmanship on display here is admirable enough to warrant attention. I'm genuinely looking forward to watching speedrunners tackle this game, and I'm hoping I can find at least a couple of consistent runners on Twitch to check out who are always pushing the limits. If you folks enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe. I'm not going to break any arms over it. All I ask is that you all take care out there. Stay safe.